Lord, we are grateful for every day that you give us, and we ask that you would guide us now to hear, to comprehend, and to apply what you're teaching us. Amen. Why does Thomas get such a bad rap? You ever think about that? Let's put it in perspective. If I told you that yesterday over at the Port Charlotte Mall, I saw Arnold Schwarzenegger, what would you think? Is it possible? Okay, it's possible. It actually could happen that I saw Arnold Schwarzenegger walking through the Port Charlotte Mall. It's not likely, but you know me, and you know that I wouldn't lie to you unless it was for a sermon illustration. So you know that, okay, well, yeah, that's possible. Okay, now let's say that I told you I just had seen John Leonard yesterday over at the Port Charlotte Mall. John Lennon. Did I say Leonard? John Lennon. Take two. Let's say I saw John Lennon. Now what do you think?
No.
Yeah, that's not quite so likely. Now, you might think, okay, maybe I saw someone that looked like John Lennon. Maybe I saw a John Lennon impersonator. Maybe I met somebody whose name was actually John Lennon, but wasn't the John Lennon from the Beatles. But for me to say that I saw John Lennon from the Beatles walking around the mall yesterday, you're going to say, no, Pastor, I don't think so. So why does Thomas get such a bad rap? Jesus was dead. There is no doubt about the fact that he died. And when people die, do you expect to see them walking around the next day, the next week? What do we often call Thomas? Doubting Thomas. And I really don't like that. I don't think that's fair. I think maybe skeptical Thomas. I think maybe searching Thomas. He wanted to know the truth. And I can't fault him. Thomas was absolutely dedicated to Jesus. Remember just a few weeks earlier, before they went to Jerusalem, Jesus was telling all the disciples about what's going to happen. We're going to go up to Jerusalem. I'm going to be arrested and killed. And the other disciples said, what? Oh, Lord, no. Let's stay down here in Galilee. People like us. Everything's friendly. Let's stay here. Thomas was the only one who said, let's also go with him so that we may die with him. Thomas got it. The other disciples had visions of grandeur. That Jesus was going to become king of Israel, and that they were going to be his cabinet, and they would sit with him left and right all around the table. They were going to be royalty themselves once Jesus took over. So for Jesus to go and die, that meant, wait a minute, no, then I don't get to be a prince. I don't get to be sitting at the table. And I'm sure there was more to it than that, but they were thinking in these human terms. And I think Thomas is the only one who saw this is what Jesus is really talking about. It doesn't sound like he's on the fence. It seems that he understands that to follow Jesus may not end in personal glory, but in great sacrifice. So when the other disciples tell Thomas that they have seen Jesus, he isn't convinced. Now why is that? What would it mean if Jesus was actually alive again? What would it mean if John Lennon came walking through those doors? Well, that would mean that everything that we know about life so far is in question. That, yeah, he really died. So for him to be back to life, something is different. Everything has changed. If Jesus is really alive again, then that fearsome enemy, death, no longer has any hold over us. The current religious structure with the temple and the animal sacrifices, no longer needed. The power the Romans had over them, not to be feared. If Jesus was really alive, everything is different. Thomas saw this, and he wanted to believe, but he had to make sure. Now let's take a break for a minute and look at something very interesting here in the text. It says that they told Thomas that Jesus was alive again, but he wasn't convinced, and the story picks up. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them. Now, did you catch that? When did this happen? A week later, Jesus was raised on what we call Easter Sunday. This is 7 days later, the next Sunday. It's a work day, for one thing, for the Jews, because their Sabbath was Saturday. This is now 7 days later, and what was the condition of the doors?
Locked.
7 days they have lived with the knowledge that Jesus is alive, and they are still locked up, hiding in the upper room. If the disciples were so convinced that Jesus was raised from the dead, why did they lock the doors? If Jesus had the power over life and death and changed everything, why were they still afraid of the Jews and the Romans? This is where I believe Thomas showed much more faith than any of the other disciples. Because even though he was hesitant, he knew that if this was true, everything was going to change. But the rest of the disciples, even though they'd seen it with their own eyes, had not changed. They were still hiding in fear. They were not letting anybody know the news. They weren't taking any risks for Jesus. Am I still locked in the upper room? Years ago, I was teaching a youth confirmation group, and we were talking about the Bible, and I picked up the Bible, and I said to them, "This book is worthless," and I threw it in the trash. There was silence. And I went and I pulled it out, and I said, "If you don't read it," it got their attention. Got their parents' attention too, let me tell you that. But isn't that true? It doesn't matter how many Bibles you have sitting on your shelf. If you don't read it, it's worthless. And at this point, the disciples' faith was useless, was worthless, because they weren't willing to trust it. They were still locked in the upper room, not telling anyone, not letting the truth change their lives. A few years ago, Willow Creek Church up in Chicago, large church, around 20,000 people come every year. They do everything to the highest level. If they can't do it at a high professional level, they won't do it. Their chief purpose is to reach people who are not yet Christians and help them to become Christians. They say they want to reach the non-religious and nominally religious. You understand that? People that are not religious at all, people that are kind of religious, and they said they want to turn non-religious and nominally religious people into fully devoted disciples of Jesus Christ. If you're already a believer, you're welcome to come and you're welcome to serve, but you're not going to sit. Their purpose is to take non-religious and nominally religious people and turn them into fully devoted disciples of Jesus Christ. That's what they want to do. And so they go through everything with a sense of, how can we help people to become more like Christ? They decided to do a huge study called Reveal. And they took 2 years to do it. They spent millions of dollars trying to study what are the practices that help people to become more like Jesus. And they went through all of these things that they thought about. They had an assumption in the back of their heads. They had an assumption that if you invite people to church and get them involved in Bible studies and get them involved in Sunday school and small groups, get them involved in things like that, that they will become more like Christ. Well, they went through all this test, all this study, and they found some results. And they were shocked. And they were embarrassed. Because part of the results said that over half of the people in their congregation said that they were stalled in their faith. They were not growing. They felt like they were maybe not as religious as they used to be. And this was their key. They wanted to help people to become more like Christ. And they found over half the people said they were stalled, that they just didn't feel like they were growing. They also found there was one specific Christian discipline above all else that the people that did practice it did grow in their faith. I mean, they were so surprised by this result, they did the entire study again. Spent another year, spent another $1 million or so, studied this to say, okay, is this true? And they found out, again, there was one particular practice above everything else that helped people walk down the path of discipleship. It was a daily time of not just reading the Bible, but applying it to their lives. That's why they were so surprised. It sounds so simple. But they said all the other things that they had assumed. Getting people involved in church activities did not help people to become more like Christ. Doesn't matter how many lawns you mow for the church. It doesn't matter how many booties you crochet. It doesn't matter how many Bible studies you sit in. It doesn't matter how many times you invite someone to a church softball team. If people are not taking a daily time of reading the Scripture and applying it to their life, they are not growing in their faith. Willow Creek said this about themselves. Does increased attendance in ministry programs automatically equate to spiritual growth? To be brutally honest, it does not. Church activity alone made no direct impact on growing the heart. They said that shocked them because they were all about being friendly, being kind, inviting people to come and sit with them, and hoping they become more like Christ by osmosis. Now, what is it that we say here a lot? You don't become more like Jesus by accident. It's the same thing. You can't just hope to sit in the church and become more like Christ. Remember a few weeks ago, your fork? How many of you still have a fork somewhere? You cannot come to church and hear a sermon and expect to become more like Jesus. You have to learn to feed yourself. Believing is not enough. Committing is what's needed. The disciples believed that Jesus had risen from the dead, but they weren't doing anything about it. They were still meeting in the upper room by themselves, among people who believed like them, spending time with people that are safe. Only Thomas saw that just believing in the resurrection wasn't going to cut it. They had to do something. Now look what happens next in this conversation between Jesus and Thomas. I love this. Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and touch my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you've seen me, you believe. Blessed are those who have not yet seen and yet believe." For most of my life, I have assumed that Jesus said this in a disapproving tone. You get that? "Come on, Thomas, why don't you believe? Come on, put your finger." No, that is not what the Scripture, it is not in there. It is not a berating tone. Jesus is not rebuking Thomas. Jesus is not putting him down for his lack of faith. He's saying very warmly and gently and invitingly, "Put your finger here. Touch my side." Everything that Thomas wanted to know, Jesus invited him to see, to do. Welcoming, encouraging, inviting. Would that we Christians were more like that. Instead of berating people and make them feeling guilty for not attending church or our activities, we should simply invite them. And if they don't show up, love them anyway. Never make somebody ashamed because they didn't fill your expectation of what a Christian should be. And don't do that to yourself. Don't beat yourself up when you fail. We all fail. When you fail, realize that Jesus is offering his hand and said, "Let's try again." Inviting you. The single most important thing you can do to grow your faith is to develop a daily time for applying the Scripture to your life. I want to give you a method that a lot of people have found very helpful. This comes from Pastor Wayne Cordero in Hawaii. Boy, that must be a difficult appointment. Over in Hawaii, he has what he calls SOAP. S-O-A-P. Some of you have heard of this before. S-O-A-P, SOAP. It says, first of all, Scripture. And they've got lots of scriptures that you can choose from, prefab, or you can do your own. But start with a passage of Scripture and read it. And then read it again. Read it 2 or 3 times, maybe 4 times. Read through the Scripture. Just read it. And get a sense of it. And then O, observation. Have a notebook or something and write down what you see. Write down something you hadn't noticed before. Write down something that makes you think of. Just observe the scripture that you've just read. Then A, application. What is God saying through this? Is there something in your life that this applies to? Is there something in the life of someone you love that this applies to, that you can take to them? And then P, write down a prayer. Just a simple little prayer. So you need your notebook, you read the scripture, you observe it, you write down your observations, you apply it, write down how you think this applies, and then you pray. And he said this is a very simple way. I know some pastors that do this. They get up at this ungodly hour of 6:15 in the morning, and they go meet with other people over at Starbucks or something, and everyone does their little private study, and then they come together for 10 or 15 minutes and talk about it. So what is the end? So, what does S stand for? Scripture. She's unhappy. It's okay, Abby, we love you. S is scripture. What is O? Observation. What is A?
Apply.
Application. And P?
Prayer.
Prayer. Very simple way to do it. Write it down, and then maybe a couple weeks look at it and find out what God's been doing in the meantime when you weren't expecting it. It's as simple as that. This is what is going to help you to grow in your faith. It's not just about believing. As we said last week, the demons believe in God. They just don't follow him. It's more than just believing that Jesus is alive. It's taking that knowledge and applying it to your life. It's letting Jesus change me to make me more like him. I want to be more like Thomas. I want to believe that this changes everything. I don't want to sit in a safe place with people that love me and we just gather together and say how wonderful Jesus is. I want to be opening up those doors and going out and finding where the struggle is and where the pain is and taking the hope of Jesus there. You are here today for one of two reasons. And I believe this for every single person. You're not here by accident. You are here today because God designed it. And there's one of two reasons why you're here. You are either here because there is some part of you that Jesus wants to heal. There's some part of you that's broken, some part of you that's frustrated, angry. There's some part of you that Jesus wants to heal. Or you are here because Jesus wants to use you to offer healing to somebody else. That's why you're here today. You're either here to receive a healing or to let Jesus use you to heal somebody. There is no greater purpose in the world than to join Jesus in his ministry of offering hope and healing. We heard this morning that we finally completed a house for Habitat, that a family can have a safe place to live. We support his church over in Cuba so that they can have some of the basic things that we take for granted and they can teach the gospel of Jesus Christ to others. We're already involved in this ministry of healing, so now let's apply it to our own lives. Let's take each day as another opportunity to dedicate ourselves to Jesus, to be like Thomas, to say, Lord, I need some help. And then when Jesus gives it to us, to say, Lord, I'm all in. I will not be afraid. We're going to share together now in Holy Communion. This is our remembrance of what Jesus has done for us. And during this time, would you come forward? I ask you at the altar here that if you need a healing, if you need something broken in you fixed, then Jesus wants to heal. And just leave your hands open in front of you here at the altar. I'll come pray with you. And there may be someone else that you know that needs a healing. And I ask you to bring maybe that person forward in your heart. If they're here, bring them with you. But if they're at home somewhere, then bring them with you and lift them up to God in prayer and say, Lord, how do you want to use me so that they can find this healing?